Good evening and welcome to Know Before You Grow. I'm Dan Like, and as always, and I'm especially feeling guilty about how I've overcommitted myself and I'm not keeping up with things. Thanks to Dave Alden and Sharon Kirk for doing the actual stuff behind this. Kevin, you keep unmuting yourself. I keep muting you because you've got background noise. Okay. So a few housekeeping notes before we get started on the evening. First, we have been Zoom bombed in the past. We will undoubtedly be Zoom bombed in the future. If things get weird, I will lock the screen and mute everything and then sort it out and kick a bunch of people and come back. If you get kicked accidentally, please come back again. Related to that, I am going to lock the meeting or start acquiring, enable the waiting room for people now. And so if people who arrive late and I don't admit them, if you know somebody who's complaining about this in text messages to you, please tell them to answer things in the chat room. I will keep track of stuff in the chat room so that we can put those into questions and comments for our speakers as we go along. Also, if you are not currently subscribed to the Urban Chat mailing list, may I strongly recommend that you go to urbanchat.org and subscribe to that, because that has everything that I'm going to put in the upcoming events thing, which right now is a Know Before You Grow on March 22nd, which is going to be on housing availability and homelessness. And on March 23rd, we're going to have lunch at Aqua's Cafe, which is always an interesting conversation, which is totally free form and goes wherever it goes. Speaking for us this evening, we have Riley, I'm going to say it, try it the German, Weissenborn. Oh, and I just had to admit somebody and flip my screen. Oh, first, let me acknowledge the electeds who I've seen come in, and if I don't announce you, then it's going to become a bit, and it will happen in the future. We have with us tonight Councilmember John Tribs and Mayor Kevin McDonald are the people I've noticed coming in.
And Councilmember Dennis Posake.
Ah, I'm sorry I missed you, Dennis. There's my running gag. Yes, so with us this evening we have Riley Weissenborn and Jocelyn Lynn. Riley is a project manager with Mid-Penn Housing. Jocelyn Lynn is is the Associate Director of Housing Development at Burbank Housing. I believe the way this was going to start was Riley was going to speak first. So Riley, the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to share my screen here. I've got 2 slides to go through, and then we'll jump into it. All right, can you all see that?
Yes.
Excellent. All righty. So I'm just going to chat for 5 minutes or so. And really what I wanted to cover was the cost of construction and funding of low-income housing in Sonoma County, and the challenges and complexities that come with that. There's always a lot of confusion and questions around why affordable housing is so expensive. Why is it so hard to fund it? Why does it take so long, to go from site acquisition to lease up, and why that process is so long? So hopefully this sheds a little bit of light on that. So just jumping right into it, in affordable housing specifically, we often evaluate what the cost to build a project is by looking at the total development costs per unit, and that's kind of a quick way to judge projects across the board of how cheap or how expensive units are coming in standalone. So for example, a 60-unit development that costs $30 million to build, the cost per unit would be roughly $500,000. Just looking, quickly at Mid-Penn's current pipeline across 35 projects across the Bay Area. So that's Sonoma, Napa County, Alameda, Santa Rosa, or Santa Clara, San Mateo, and all the way as far down as Santa Cruz and Monterey counties. And these are projects that are in our pipeline right now. Any stage from actively in construction to, pre-development, our average cost per unit right now is at just over $800,000 per unit. There's a lot of factors that go into what makes affordable housing development expensive. Some of these things, cross over to market rate and other types of development as well, but these are certainly some things that are hitting affordable housing. So the general cost of materials and labor increasing over time, we're finding, especially with the pandemic, that definitely increased. Availability of contractors, shortages of materials and getting things from overseas definitely increased project costs. Cost for land, excuse me, has been ever increasing, especially as land is located near high quality amenities such as transit, community services, etc. The land is definitely not cheap, and that's no different here in Petaluma. Energy efficiency requirements that are required through state and funding programs, prevailing wage, which increases the cost of a development by roughly 20%. So that adds a massive increase to the cost. And then impact fees and permit fees, which are always increasing, although the city has done a great job recently with impact fee waivers for affordable housing projects. And all of that, is problematic for affordable housing on all levels and throughout the greater Bay Area, but it makes it even more challenging for Sonoma County and Petaluma specifically. All right, next slide here. So yeah, that first slide was, just a quick overview of about why it's so expensive and the cost there and some factors. And then the next piece here is, going into how are projects funded, what does that funding stack look like, and the challenges that we've been seeing over the last 5 to 10 years. So the typical funding stack, and please note this is a very broad brushed, average looking project, and projects can vary in types and residents that they serve and what type of funding they can or can't go for. So this is by no means a single example to capture everything. It's just a very basic general example. So typical funding stack is you'd have your construction loan during construction, and that loan would then get replaced by the tax credit equity that you get from the state, and that comes in after you've completed the project and you've converted to your permanent loan. You've got your permanent loan, which is supported by tenant rental income and Section 8 income, and I have it flagged here and highlighted to come back to later, and it's an important piece for Petaluma and Sonoma County. So the construction loan and tax credit equity kind of combined make up roughly 60 to 70% of your whole funding stack of a project. And then you've got your permanent loan, which generally is around 10% here of what we're finding in Sonoma County. And then the balance, the last 20 to 30% of your funding that you need for your project is filled in from other local and state sources, as well as potentially equity or developer fee that is put back into the project by the developer. Funding though for projects has definitely gotten harder and more complicated over the last 5 to 10 years. Just speaking from experience on my own projects in Sonoma County, 5 to 10 years ago, you could fund a project with only 3 to 5 local and state sources, and that was that. It was pretty straightforward. Now it's taking 7 to 9 or more state and local sources, in addition to construction loan, permanent loan, tax credit equity, all those things that are pretty constant across all projects. So it's taking about twice as many local and state sources to cobble together to put together a funding project. Excuse me. And just for example, 4 and 4 Petaluma, which is the project of ours that's in construction right now on Petaluma Boulevard North, it took 13 sources combined to fund that project across it. And 9 of which were local and state sources, and it required us to submit over 15 funding applications just to get it through the door, which is pretty unheard of for a single project. So, and then, that's generally the typical funding stack for a project, and how that kind of folds into why it's increasingly difficult for Sonoma County, excuse me, is for a few reasons. One is that there's just a lower access of local funding. It's just the quantity of funding that the city of Petaluma, Sonoma County, Santa Rosa, these local municipalities can pull together on an annual basis is a lot lower than places like Alameda, San Mateo, Santa Clara counties that can, they've got 20, 30, 40 million dollars that they can disperse across projects in individual jurisdictions. So it's quite a staggering difference. And our projects, once we get to the state level, we're having to compete with other projects throughout the Bay Area and the state who have a higher access to a bigger funding pool. So it's definitely more challenging to be competitive there. And then the other piece is the tenant income and the Section 8 rents that we receive in Sonoma County are around 30% or more lower than other counties. And the direct impact there is, excuse me, the higher your tenant income and Section 8 rents that you're able to pull in for your project on an operational annual basis, your permanent loan can be higher. So for example, on 414 Petaluma, our permanent loan is only able to support about 10% of the full funding stack. But on other projects of ours that are in San Mateo County, even of the same project size, because rental incomes are significantly higher and Section 8 income payments are significantly higher, it allows those projects to support 20 or 30% of the funding stack. And why that's important is that, the higher that the permanent loan is that you're able to support, the less reliance that you have on needing to cobble together additional local and state sources. So Sonoma County is definitely at a bit of a disadvantage there, that there's only so much that we can get with permanent loan, and it requires us to really go after any source possible at the state and local level. So with that, I'll turn my time over back to Dan.
Well, I've got a couple of questions queued up, but Jocelyn, if you've got a few words, why don't you take over for a bit, and then we can toss those between both of you, and then we can do our video.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm with Burbank Housing, and we actually have 2 projects in Petaluma, and I'm happy to talk about those. But to follow up on what Riley said, and first of all, Riley, that was very thorough. So that was great, and great background and overview. And I concur with all your points and what you're saying. One of the things that you touched on is that funding is competitive. When we talk about state funding, we're looking at funding that comes from the California Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD. And a lot of those projects, you have to be, the top project and hit all the scoring criteria, hit the tiebreakers. They get down to even the nitpicking on the tiebreakers. And those projects oftentimes, in the ways that Riley described, sometimes favor, urban communities that, again, have more access to that state funding source. Local funding sources, which in tax credits, there's something called soft source leveraging, and the tiebreaker, and they get, higher priority. Site amenities is a big deal. How close are you to transit? How close are you to grocery stores? Are you within walking distance? How about transit? Those are all bonus, and extra points and all that kind of stuff. So when you get to these applications, there are, sometimes up to 100 applications for, a funding source, and, you're just trying to get in. For tax credits, they, they separate it by regions. And I know someone had a question about, how competitive are tax credits. It is really hard for the northern region, which is where we're in Sonoma County, to compete effectively for tax credits. And again, a lot of it goes back to some of the same stuff about, not being able to be in that urban environment where you can score well on site amenities, where you have more local funding sources that help you in the tiebreaker scoring for, soft source leveraging, and and just generally the pool of applicants is just big. So I mean, when we talk about why it's so hard, it's like more funding is kind of where we're needed. Of course, there's a lot of other roadblocks we can get into, in terms of affordable housing. We can get into like the entitlements process and CEQA and all that kind of stuff, which have stalled some projects. It stalled some of ours, one in particular that I've worked on in Napa. But, the state legislature has started to come up with tools to kind of get around that. And you probably have heard some of those streamlining bills like SB 35 and AB 2162. So there are ways kind of around that. But, the cost to construct, and when Riley talked about total development costs, that's all in, that's everything. That's land, all the acquisition costs, and that, goes all the way, includes all the way, hard costs and soft costs. So that could include, the capitalized reserves that you're going to have to need to sustain your project, once you go into operations. And so total development costs, are high, and there's a lot of different pieces to it. What we're seeing is the construction industry, as you all know, cost to build, lumber, steel, concrete, all that stuff, especially during the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, with inflation, with supply chain issues, it has affected us on our projects where, we've had to kind of go back for additional gap financing, or we've had to value engineer some of our projects so that we can make the numbers, balance out. And so, these are all challenges that, we're facing. Prevailing wage, as Riley mentioned, is a big one. It does add about, Riley, you're right. It adds about 20% extra if compared to a non-prevailing wage project. And most funding sources now, require it, or if they don't require it, it's another, it's another factor in your scoring. If you indicate and make a commitment that you'll do prevailing wage, you get a little boost in your application. So when you're applying for funding, so oftentimes, that's the route we go. And then some other sources is just flat out required. And so, it's tough, and so all these challenges, make it harder to compete and to, compete for that smaller pool of funding that, we're seeing. Of course, there's been movement in some areas where there's been expansion in the funding sources for permanent supportive housing. So I don't know if you've heard of the Home Key program that HCD has started a couple years ago in the pandemic. Burbank Housing has actually taken on a lot of home key projects, and these are state grants, and the money comes fast. They want you to, build fast. And, one of our projects in Petaluma Studios at Montero is a home key project. And, we've also done 2 in Napa, one's still under construction, and one in Santa Rosa, one with the city of Healdsburg. And so Home Key is a project where, a program in which we've been able to see an easier route to being able to develop, and at least on the permanent supportive housing side, because it comes in as a grant from the California Department of Housing and Community Development. So sorry, I can keep going on and on, but I'll stop right there. But I want to mention our other project in Petaluma, and we call it Petaluma River Place. And Riley, I think it's similar to the Mid-Penn project, where it's a combination of 2 different sources of MPLH and CERNA. And we can get into the discussion of how suddenly we come up with like these kinds of funding. It's kind of like what's available and what you can compete for, and those were available. And it's surprising that within Petaluma we have the same setup with the same 2 sources.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm pretty sure our projects are tracking really similarly. I think just project size, how we funded it, they're funded very similarly. So they're pretty identical projects by separate developers. So that's a good point.
Right.
So just to drop back a little bit and give a little background, what percent of area median income do the projects that both of you work on tend to target?
Typically, it's 60% AMI and below. So it's usually 30 to 60% AMI. Sometimes we'll dip down to 20, 25, depending on the project. Some projects will go up to 80% AMI. It kind of just depends on, size of the project, characteristics, and things like that.
And Riley, you'd mentioned that the local tenants generally give you 30% lower income for your ongoing operating costs. Is that because this area has a weird distribution of where the lower AMI people come from?
It's more of that Sonoma County as a whole, the average income is lower than San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, Alameda County. So, they look at, they'll take it from 100% AMI. So we'll use round numbers. Let's say Sonoma County's average is $100,000 for the household, whereas, San Mateo County might be $150,000. And that's how rents are set, is based off of area median income for that county. So you're going to have higher income areas like Alameda, like Santa Clara, like San Mateo that they can collect higher rents from their tenants because that's what's set by the state and the federal government. Whereas Sonoma County does not. And like I mentioned before, building a 40-unit development in Petaluma is roughly going to be the same cost to build in San Mateo. You might have some things here or there that are slightly higher or lower, but generally it's around the same ballpark. But they're able to collect more rents, which allows them to support a higher perm loan, which allows them to not rely as heavily on local and state sources. So it's a pretty compounding effect.
Okay. You mentioned the issues with the prevailing wage, and I think you've talked some about what prevailing wage means, but we saw they increases the cost by 20%. We're kind of wondering what the baseline is. Is that because you're paying union labor, or is that, versus like Central Valley labor, or what's that referenced?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it. Jocelyn, feel free to jump in too. But yeah, I mean, it's where there's prevailing wages that are set by the state and federal government. So there's two different wage rates that contractors and the subcontractors have to go by, and those are generally at or higher than union wages. So yeah, they're significantly higher versus, a market rate developer can build with no union, no prevailing wage, and they're going to be paying their labor 20% cheaper.
Okay.
Right. And to add on to that, and it's that cost per labor, but then there's the added factor of monitoring. And then you end up needing a wage consultant to come and help with the monitoring. And, and your, general contractor has to show, proof, of all the subs and having, to comply with that, wage requirement and the wage determination. So there's added costs of compliance to deal with that as well.
That's a really good point. It's something I didn't even think to mention. And then you add on to the fact that there are some subcontractors who, if they find out that it's a prevailing wage project, they won't even bid it because they don't want to deal with prevailing wage. And now you might be losing a low bid because they don't even want to bother. And so
Right.
Okay. Jocelyn, you mentioned soft source leveraging. I assume this is kind of a matching grant sort of deal where people will give you money if other people are giving you money.
Yeah, and Riley, you can jump in. It comes in the tax credit application, and in the 9% like tax credits, a specific scoring criteria, but I'm not sure. I think it's in the tiebreaker scoring. And so the thing is, you usually have to score full points to like even be in the running for, getting tax credits. And so they had to create this whole section, which was the tiebreaker section, and there's different elements to it. And you have to be competitive in that and in there. And one of the things is to be able to show that there are, community-based type of funds, that the city has, provided funding, or the county, local sources. And that gives you a little boost there. And there's some calculation with how that all works. That I would say that, tax credits are just hard. One of the benefits we had from the wildfires up in Sonoma County is that this area was declared a disaster area. And so in 2020 and 2021, there were what they call disaster tax credits. And so we were able to benefit from that. And so we were actually able to we could bypass that whole scoring criteria. They scrapped it, used a different scoring criteria for disaster tax credit projects. And Burbank was actually awarded 3 different projects under the disaster tax credits program. So that was helpful.
And 4 and 4 Petaluma also received disaster tax credits. And without that disaster, I mean, it's like the one silver lining of all the wildfires is it helped add some stimulus there for affordable housing development. And without those disaster credits, I mean, who knows how long 4 and 4 and Burbank's project River Place.
Petaluma River Place.
Petaluma, like, who knows how long those would still be in the queue, still fighting for tax credits, and it's just so.
Right. That one actually, it wasn't awarded tax credit, so that one's actually accelerated.
Oh, apologies. There you go.
No, but our other ones, one was in Napa and 2 were in Santa Rosa, or our disaster tax credit ones. But yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about how tax credits worked? It sounded like that was something that helped you pay off the construction loan, if I understand it right, but I'm not totally sure how
it works. Yeah, it's like a takeout source for construction, and it comes in at perm closing. So I mean, you will get, I think, usually about 10% of the equity at construction closing that you can use during the construction phase, but it really comes in at the permanent phase after you've completed your construction, and it's used to take out the construction loan and pay off the construction loan. Of course, you'll have other construction sources. Again, tax credits aren't the only source, and those construction loans oftentimes just convert to perm. And I mean, there are a lot of different types of factors, but yes, tax credits are awarded through the Tax Credit Allocation Committee. It's a state agency, and it kind of funnels, like, each state has their own allocation agency, and you apply to them and for a reservation for an award. And the way tax credits work is that, we as nonprofit affordable housing developers, tax credits don't benefit us. We're tax exempt entities, right? So we partner with an investor, private, on private sector side, that can benefit from the tax credits. And usually, so we sell them in a sense, and they can take the benefit of it, or they resell it, repackage it, and through this whole syndication process. But the point is, with tax credit equity, you have a tax credit investor. So it's a private partner that's in this deal with you, and they're in it with you for a term of 15 years. And, they're the limited partner. You, as the developer / owner, are the GP, the general partner, and you're in this partnership together that owns this property, so to speak. So, yeah, does that make sense? It's kind of, yeah. I don't want to get into the details, but too much.
Now I do. But yeah,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, because it's okay. So basically, it's like you partner with the limited partner who does some running of some of the operations stuff on the building longer term, or the 15-year term, and that they then get a credit on the taxes they'd otherwise pay.
Yeah, well, they purchase the tax, so we get the tax credit award, but we can't use it. So in a sense, we sell it to them. They give us equity. So they're a partner in the project. they don't run the operations, but they're a partner. The GP, is the one who runs and does the operates, usually the nonprofit affordable housing developer that owns and operates the property. The tax credit investor, they want to take benefits from this.
Right.
There's two ways: is the tax credits from the start, that we sell to them. And the second is they take losses from, the project, so oftentimes a lot of our projects, it gets into like capital counts and things like that.
Yeah, no, this
But,
is really complex.
they like to take losses because then they can take a tax write-off. And so they work it out so that it works out to their tax benefit. And, our projects, we just want to see it sustainable. We are not, our cash flow is usually not really high. It's just enough to pay off operating expenses. Whatever residual we'll have, we'll usually go, first, if there's hard debt, it'll go to debt service. But beyond that, if there's residual, it goes to, a lot of this, what we call the soft sources in the project. But usually by that time, we call it the waterfall. There's not there's not much money after that. So those are called the residual receipts payments. But net operating income is usually not really high on a lot of these, because the goal isn't to make a ton of money.
Right.
And so, we're just trying to make it work and to last for 15 years. So
This is fascinating, and no wonder if you're juggling a bunch of different funding sources, it gets even more complex.
yeah, and I'll let Riley jump in. I'm sure he's got a lot more to say.
No, you're doing a great job. Explaining tax credits in layman terms is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And yeah, way to go. That was good.
Cool. What about funding sources by different client types, like vets, farm workers, other workforce things? How do they kind of weigh in there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, there's different funding types, usually through the state, for different populations. So, Joe Cerna, farm worker, so that definitely targets farm worker and agricultural worker families and households. There's No Place Like Home, which targets chronically homeless and folks with severe mental illness. There's what else? There's Project Home Key, which also targets supportive housing. So anytime you hear supportive housing, it's targeting folks who are homeless, who have mental health issues. Those are the big ones. There's like little pockets for other certain things. We try and target teacher housing where we can. There's definitely seniors, senior specific developments. And then there's VASH vouchers, which are and other programs that provide housing assistance and funding for projects that target veterans and homeless veterans. So there's definitely these different pockets. And, like traditionally you would do just a family project and you might sprinkle in some supportive units here and there, or you might sprinkle in some farm worker units here or there. But it's getting more difficult to cobble together all of these different funding sources. We're finding that now, like we're having to mix several different types of populations just because we need to go after whatever funding is available. So in the case of 414 Petaluma, and I believe Jocelyn said for Petaluma River Place, those two projects, we both are targeting family. We're targeting supportive, so No Place Like Home, so homeless and mental health residents, and then we're also targeting farm worker. So we're cramming three different population types in there who have their own set of needs and services and things like that, and which then requires a significantly robust resident services program and budget, which is an additional expense, and partnering with local nonprofits that can provide those services. So it's getting more and more complicated again.
So that kind of leads into a question that came into me on the chat, which is, what does that market look like for the tax credits, and does that do all of those different funding sources put conditions on the tax credits that make those even harder to sell to your limited partners?
I don't know that it would make it more difficult to sell to the limited partners. I think there's definitely within tax credits, there's tax credits by region. So the North Bay region, coast, peninsula, like San Francisco has its own region. So there's tax credits set up by region, but then there's also tax credits that are also funding other smaller pots, like excuse me. Oh, Jocelyn, I'm blanking. There's a couple like very specific targeted tax credit pools that you can also like. Oh, I'm blanking on it. I haven't submitted for them in quite some time, so it's off my brain at the moment.
But the point is that you don't have like lots of restrictions on those tax credits when you go out and have to find exactly the limited partner. There's kind of a market for finding those limited partners, people who are in there.
Yeah, so I mean, you apply for your tax credits first, and if you get a tax credit award, now you've got that award, you've got that from the state, and then at that point you go out to various private banks and say, all right, we got this award for this type of project. Would you like to purchase these tax credits, and for how much? And so then there's the negotiation there of, man, I'm hacking up a lung here. Then there's the negotiation with one or two banks, and
and Riley, I completely sympathize. This is my first day kind of feeling like I can actually talk to humans again.
Yeah.
So while Riley's out of play, have a question about smaller 6 to 10 unit projects. I know that I'm familiar with the Burbank managed Vida Nueva up in Roanoke Park, which seems like a fairly small project. What kind of economies of scale are there? What do you get from small projects or large projects?
Yeah, well, those small ones, I guess that's Burbank managed, so it's not owned and operated by or it's operated but not owned by Burbank. Projects have to be of a certain size before we could actually really make the numbers work and make them pencil. So for like a tax credit project, 50 is kind of like the minimum. 50 units is kind of like the minimum. Otherwise, it is really difficult to make it work, because there are some sunk costs, in the development budget. And, yeah, it's not going to pencil out if the units, aren't going to be enough. And so, yes, but at the same time, if it's not tax credit, we're looking at like Home Key, which, is a program. Again, it's a grant to purchase motels and renovate those for permit supportive housing. That could be, of any size. So, I mean, it really is, dependent. But yeah, I would say for tax credits, we usually target about 50 units at the minimum.
Okay, and that obviously causes some challenges with getting that population, just from a larger cultural standpoint, causes challenges with getting that population kind of distributed out through a more economically diverse neighborhood, because you're unfortunately concentrating all your low-income people in one building or a couple of buildings.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing you brought up, because Home Key doesn't mind that it's 100% affordable. 100% permanent supportive housing, but the other funding source, No Place Like Home, which Riley's project has, the one in Petaluma, and which we have in our Petaluma project, as well as a Napa project and a project in Santa Rosa. No Place Like Home actually doesn't want, it's geared toward permanent supportive housing, but they don't want you to have 100% permanent supportive housing. They have an integration policy. They want your project to be more mixed income. And so it can't just be, the 30% AMI with, for this vulnerable population. So, they want to see folks integrated. And so, so that's an interesting thing. Yeah, you brought up, I think the state, has recognized that and has tried to, work on that. And so we had to show in our application that we were going to have no more than 49% of the units be permanent supportive housing, just to meet that integration policy.
Okay, yeah, so that also ties you back to, well, obviously the scoring well on amenities that you mentioned earlier, but making sure that you're working with other developers doing the rest of the project, because presumably you aren't building the above the all of the units that would make up that kind of larger, more less homogeneous neighborhood.
Right, right.
Have a question in the chat about how do large corporate housing donations come into play in the funding of low-income housing projects? Do they come into play?
Do they come into play? We have large philanthropic donations. Usually they're usually like 1 million, 2 million. They help fund the gap, you know. So on our projects, we've had Providence come in with money. We've had oh gosh, I'm blanking on them. San Francisco based organization, but you know, big nonprofit group. But you know, they're philanthropic dollars. Don't believe we've had corporate sponsors, and I don't know how that plays into it. Yeah, we've not had that.
Okay, it would probably make sense that by the time corporate dollars get philanthropic, they've been pushed through some sort of distributing foundation anyway. So
Right, exactly. Yeah. So community foundations have been, our source.
right. And I do want to get to the video that Dave mentioned, because it kind of gives an image of what could be if we can get there. But before we play that, we did have in the competition for tax credits, we had and I always like to give people what can you do? Because often we get into the learning about and away from the action. Do you have like 3 bullet points that could loosen the tax equity funding stream?
Gosh, well, there's been movement in the area. They kind of we've advocated in the past to change some of the way TCAC does the regions. So a few years back, you know, we used to be lumped in, I believe, with like Alameda County, and that's again a more urban county. And then we, you know, pushed for the North Bay to kind of be the separate region. Now they do stuff sort of like there's a coastal region, and you know, but you know, besides doing that kind of stuff of just trying to be in a pool that's less competitive, you know, I don't know. I mean, I would refer you to, you know, our director of portfolio finance at Burbank, who lives and breathes TCAC and does a lot of advocacy work on behalf of our organization to push for like how we can get tax credits better. So I might have to get back to you. I don't know what solutions there are, but I know that we're trying to push for those. Yeah.
I think one of the things that we kind of need to have some conversations about in Know Before You Grow in Urban Chat is like, how do we figure out how to support our legislators and figure out what those paths are. Okay, 2 more questions here, and then we'll get to the video. One was about compensation in like the nonprofit housing sector versus commercial profit sector. I assume y'all love your work and are in it because you love your work. But I also believe that people need to get compensated fairly for their work. Is it like people are eating caviar and getting rich off of nonprofit housing developments, or are you roughly compensated at the market rates?
Gosh, I mean, I don't know. You mean compensated in terms of like what a market rate developer?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, in particular, there was a, you know, the comment was taking from the IRS 990 forms. The commenter threw a bunch of things about what CEOs of these various organizations get paid, and they didn't look out of line to me. But I have no idea.
Oh, so some felt like it was like maybe too high or something like that.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like, you know, the pay scale I've seen have been comparable to what a government employee would make. I do think maybe at the CEO level, it may be a little different because they're at that executive level, but I would say staff and everything is probably comparable to, you know, what you get paid in the government, you know.
Okay, yeah, that's Yeah, and Jerry said, hey, he just wants discussion, not judging, and I think that's fair.
Right.
And the other question from Jerry is, are there any advantages to B corporations versus nonprofits? That's really getting into the weeds, I think, but I also suspect that B Corps still have to pay a different set of tax structures than nonprofits. So I suspect that nonprofit is the better structure for that.
For
For
affordable housing development.
yeah.
Well, there are for-profit affordable housing developers out there. I assume their financing structure and their capital stack looks a little different than ours.
Okay.
But I will say that in a lot of applications, you do get an extra point or bonus for being a nonprofit developer. So
Okay.
that helps in that sense. But
Presumably they wouldn't have
for-profit.
to necessarily have that limited partner for the tax equity stuff later.
Well, I think they still set that all up, but it could, yeah, I mean, I don't know how it works. My guess is, unless they take the tax credits themselves, I don't know. But I mean, I
Right.
think they still have to set up like the same type of entity in terms of the legal structure.
Okay. Yeah. Boy, this stuff can get really deep.
Mhm.
Cool. Thanks. I'm going to we'll run the video now. And this is Vienna's look at how over the last century they went from a huge post World War I homeless population to a structure that looks pretty amazing now. And if all of my technology works correctly here.
And if I could just make a comment or two before you start, Dan.
Lock in. Yeah.
The video is from a tour taken by Spur of the Viennese model. Probably most of you know who Spur is. It's the San Francisco Planning and Urban Research Association. They've been doing what Urban Chat does in a much bigger way for more than a century. Great folks. I've belonged to them for years. Do run a lot of good videos, and they've given us permission to use any video we wish, as long as we give them credit for it. So this is me giving credit to Spur and thanking them very much.
And we are playing an excerpt of them, and hopefully I've got this all cued exactly right. Here goes.
Very good. Thanks.
A large part of that is due to the fact that they have really affordable housing. It is the most affordable large city in Europe. It has high quality housing, and it also has, as a consequence of their housing supply, that has a low crime rate. It has a very high, lots of culture, and people are out on the street. It's a very active city, a very fun city to be to live in, and people generally like living there. The first social housing building was built in 1922. That was the very first construction. And so when we were there, we were sort of recognizing and celebrating the 100th year of social housing being built. And since then, in the first 5 years after 1918, from 1918, the first 5 years after 1922, I'm sorry, they built 65,000 units of social housing. So they went on a massive development campaign shortly after World War I, pushed by a coalition of folks. There was, and I'll just touch on the coalition and then we can move on. What happened in 1920, basically, women got the vote. So that was a first big change. A lot of the immigrant population moving into Vienna were taking industrial jobs coming from Eastern Europe. Vienna sits at the border of Slovakia and very close to Poland and very close to Hungary, or actually on the border of Hungary. And people that were moving into the city were largely taking industrial jobs. And so there was momentum coming out of the labor union movement, as well as large employers trying to solve the housing crisis. And then finally, the folks that are called wild settlers, basically people who built houses or were squatters on a lot of public land and started subsistence farming, became a coalition, or they kind of unionized themselves into a self-help cooperative. And those three forces, the wild settlers, the women getting the vote, and the labor union movement, coalesced into a large group of people pushing for housing. And so when the first mayor in 1918, as the city became its own state, it is a city state, the first mayor, who was a socialist mayor elected in 1918, allied himself with those forces and started to launch what they call a housing offensive. So they really put together a plan to start rapidly building housing in Vienna. Let's go on. So where kind of the big ideas we wanted to talk about today are some of the things that are driving the social housing in Vienna. First is this concept of housing for all, which is a very inclusive sort of big tent approach to housing. Another key driver in Vienna is that they have sufficient predictable amount of capital that flows into their affordable housing system. They have a very proactive public land strategy with a land bank. They have a financing system that's rather efficient. It's called cost-based financing, and or LPHA, which is limited profit housing associations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it is a relatively more modern approach to financing. They didn't do that in the first 50 years of their housing development. They started to shift towards that about 50 years in. But the model is now being picked up by many cities around the world, in particular Ireland. Dublin's looking at it very closely, and it's considered a very efficient way to scale up housing. And then they have a big focus on innovation and environmental sustainability, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Let's go to the next slide. So to begin with, I thought it would be helpful to show some local comparisons just to give some context for housing supply in Vienna. So Vienna, Austria, the city/state, is very close to the same size as the city of San Jose in terms of land area. It is much more densely built out than San Jose, but it's not as densely built out as San Francisco. So it's sort of halfway between San Francisco and San Jose in terms of densities. The total population in Vienna is 1.9 million, and their total housing units is 1 million. When you compare that to the housing supply in both San Francisco and San Jose, you can see that there's actually significantly less housing. San Francisco, with 887,000 people, has about 340,000 units, and San Jose, with 1 million people, has about 322,000 units. So they're somewhat off the pace of what they should be. San Francisco, if it mirrored Vienna, would be closer to 450,000 units, and San Jose would be closer to about 500,000 units. The total affordable housing supply, though, is where you see really significant differences. So with 100 years of investing pretty heavily in social housing, Vienna has amassed a total of about 440,000 units of affordable housing. Keeping in mind, it's what we call the big tent, or they serve a much wider income level than our affordable housing, but by comparison, San Francisco has 30,000 units and San Jose has 17,500. So there's just a very big difference in the number of housing units. Even when you add in Section 8, which Vienna doesn't have, they do not do rent support separate from their affordable system. San Francisco adds another, I believe it's another 6,000 or 7,000 units in San Jose. Also, actually, San Jose has about 15,000 Section 8 units. So San Jose has a lot more rental, no public housing. Their homelessness numbers, Vienna does have some homelessness. It's not completely without homelessness. It has what we would term as a functional zero, because they are able to house every single person who becomes homeless very, very rapidly. They have their current count is about 2,200 homeless individuals in a city of 2 million. And that compares to the San Francisco and San Jose, which have more than double the number of homeless people, even though the populations are significantly less than half. So the most important thing to really think about is, what is it like to have a wide or large supply of affordable housing? Lastly, I'll just add that Vienna has two types of housing, two primary types of affordable housing or social housing. About 20% of the units, 21% or 200,000, 220,000 units are public housing owned by the city, so municipally owned housing. And that is traditional social housing. That was what they started building in 1917, 1922. That's what they started building at that time. And then over time, it's migrated to having significantly more privately held affordable housing called limited profit housing. We think of that more like the way we do affordable housing, which is our tax credit system. So that would be the sort of the parallel. We have a much smaller public housing segment, and more of our housing is privately held, nonprofit. Theirs is about 50-50. The other slice here is student housing and subleases and things. So they have a lot less market rate housing than we do, and they virtually have very, very small amount of single family home ownership. It's primarily a multifamily city, and it's built out specifically that way. Let's go to the next slide. So housing for all, just kind of this policy is that in Vienna, they believe that the government should intervene in the housing market because the housing market doesn't quite work. And so they have this very broad approach to how they define social housing. 80% of the people or 80% of the residents qualify for social housing. It serves incomes of up to 200% of the area median. And of course, everything to the deepest levels of poverty. So they really have a wide variety of housing types. They have set-asides for low-income and vulnerable groups, very short waiting lists, generally not more than a year, usually about 3-month waiting lists to get into housing. So it does vary depending upon what unit you're trying to get and specific circumstances of your family. It's a very needs-based orientation, so they focus a lot on less on what your income is and more on what is the urgent issue that's driving you to need housing. And particularly vulnerable groups will get prioritized first. Families, particularly single parents with children, as well as senior citizens who are living on lower incomes. There's a big focus on building community. They have a lot of support for folks living together, sort of building this idea that we all live together and share open spaces together. They have a very comprehensive tenant services, providing everything from legal aid or displacement prevention, dispute resolution, to community support. If you want to have a barbecue added to your neighborhood space, you call the city and they are welcoming your ideas for what will help build communities. So they're very responsive to their tenants. Tenants manage the boards of most of the housing in Vienna, so it's very tenant focused in terms of its decision-making process. And they also track tenant satisfaction, and they have a very good sense of which buildings are functioning well and which buildings are less desired by their tenants, and they will tend to prioritize their investment so that older buildings are well maintained within the community. Let's go to the next slide. There's a policy that they call social mixing. We call it affirmatively furthering fair housing. I think it came about right at the beginning where when they first started to do an aggressive campaign of building housing, they grabbed land wherever they could. The map on the left shows you the little where housing in Vienna is, affordable housing. It literally exists in every single district, every single neighborhood. And so there's a far less variability in terms of income from neighborhood to neighborhood. And they are very focused as well on ensuring that mixed income housing is being built so that that tenants within existing buildings have a variety of different professional lives, and they're very focused on trying to ensure that folks get to know one another, live together. The mayor of Vienna likes to say that you should not be able to tell a person's income by their address, and they're very proud of that. You are never asked to leave housing in Vienna. If you qualify once upon lease up, and then you're never checked again, your income can go up and your rent will stay the same. Some criticize that, thinking that there's this sort of excess subsidy going towards housing, but the philosophy in Vienna is that permanent housing and community building are priorities, and that we don't want people to actually spend all their excess cash on housing. We want them to spend it on restaurants and social life in the city and their families. You can pass your unit along to your children or your parents. And so many times in social housing, families will stay in the same place for many, many generations and many decades. And all new housing, and I'll talk about this in a minute, all new housing has a mix of incomes across different income ranges. And so it's very not uncommon that that folks that are coming out of the prison system, for example, will find housing in the same building as new families. And they really encourage that people engage together and start building sort of community life as a way to build what they call social cohesion. It's a big priority for them. Let's go to the next slide. So capital, this is probably one of the most important things that they have in Vienna, is a very predictable flow of capital into their housing system. There's a national 1% income tax that is paid 50% by the employer and 50% by the employee, that raises, that basically is given by the federal government to the states to allocate how they choose. So the city/state of Vienna gets $250 million a year, or euros a year, in revenue from this 1% income tax. And currently the exchange rate is about even, so it's close to 250 million. In addition to that, they have, with a 100-year portfolio of municipal housing, and they have quite a lot of both ground lease revenue coming off of that portfolio, as well as loan repayments. And so they have an additional $200 million annually, and that fluctuates somewhat, but coming into the budget. That 450 million euros is allocated, 85% is going to housing capital. They have a very strong preference for housing capital and new development over rent subsidies, such as Section 8. They do offer rent subsidies, but it's a very small number, and it really is to support reducing rents in social housing for families that need it. 2/3 of the capital funds are for new construction, and 1/3 is for rehabilitation. And their rehabilitation program is closely aligned with their carbon reduction program, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. 15% of the funding is going for individual subsidies and tenant services. So there is a steady supply, predictable supply of funding that is significantly higher than the funding we have for comparable size cities. And that is actually what makes the system function incredibly well and develop. They're developing about 10 to 15,000 new units per year in Vienna of social housing. Let's go on. In addition to the capital program, or actually as a consequence of the capital program, they have a very robust public land strategy. The organization that's named in the bottom of the slide, it's called Woonfonds Wien, is what we would kind of think of as like a redevelopment agency for housing specifically. The Woonfonds Wien was founded in 1984. It was originally founded to focus on the refurbishment of housing, because at that point in time, they didn't have a demand for new housing. They had built out a lot of their social housing, and they were starting to focus on the rehabilitation of older housing. However, shortly after that, into the 90s, land prices started to rise, and Woonfonds Wien took on the task of acquiring land. And now it is primarily a land acquisition and disposition agency with a very large rehab program. They do major housing development, and they purchase 15 years worth of housing needs. So they're always buying land to plan for housing. And these are many of the developments that are currently happening in Vienna. Let's go to the next slide. So this picture is actually one of the places that we visited on the trip. It's called Seestadt Aspern. And what you can see is this land was it was actually a former airfield. It had been purchased by General Motors to become an auto manufacturing plant, but that never materialized. So the Woonfonds Wien purchased it back from General Motors and planned a development. It's actually about a 20-minute train ride outside of the city of Vienna. It is halfway between the capital city of Bratislava in Slovakia and Vienna, which is the capital of Austria. So it's sort of sandwiched between two capital cities and is intended to be a hub for those two cities. The first thing they did when planning this development was build the rail system that enables residents here to travel to both of those capital cities, as well as a local rail system that goes through more neighborhoods in the Vienna area. The entire development is zoned mixed income. And as I started to say with the trains, the infrastructure investment, the government took on this process of clearing the land, building the infrastructure. So they built not only the utility infrastructure, but also, for example, the parking infrastructure. So the public sector built a parking garage and then releases land through developer competitions that don't require on-site parking. So it's really considered a walkable neighborhood with an intention that it be a no-car living, or you can have no-car living. Their developer competitions are part of the Woonfonds Wien infrastructure. They have a standing committee that gets 3-year terms that makes decisions about which projects are going to move forward, and they judge them based on a policy, on what they call the 4 pillars model. So they analyze the social sustainability, or the contribution of the building to the social infrastructure. They analyze and grade them on their design, sort of competitive on their architectural quality of the project. They evaluate and score them on environmental sustainability, and they evaluate and score them on financial feasibility. So the advisory board is made up of professionals with expertise in each of these areas, and the experts, as well as community input, they will score these projects based on those characteristics and figure out the project that is the best across all 4 metrics. Let's go on. Another large-scale urban development that we visited on the trip was Zonvenviertel. And Zonvenviertel, you could see on the picture up on the upper right, it actually was the realignment of a rail system. So the rail yard used to come down through where the park and the buildings on the right are. And there was an agreement between the city and the rail system to realign the rail. They needed to, this was the central rail station, the gray rooftops towards the back of the picture on the top is the central rail station. And all of the housing around here and this large 17-acre park is social housing. And it ranges from deeply affordable housing all the way to market rate. There are several cooperatively owned properties there. We visit a few of them. One of them is called Bikes and Rails, which actually is a co-op designed by community members that actually believe in car and rail life living, no car living. I'm not car and rail, bike and rail living with no cars. And so the infrastructure for living without a car is really wonderful here. There's a local tram as well as the main rail station. It's 5,500 new units, and it includes EV car sharing services. There's a parking garage built by the public sector as well, bicycle stalls, trains, and a large open space. And again, they're very focused on the communal living. There's also a small school here, an elementary school that goes from basically 1-year-old to 8th grade. Let's go on.
Hey, Helmi, I want to just make sure that we get to the Q&A.
Panel.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I'll go speed it up and get through the last very quickly.
Yeah.
So just briefly, thank you for telling me that. There's a variety of different housing types in social housing. The municipal housing is the more traditional, limited profit is the current one, but there's all kinds of housing that is considered social housing, including temporary emergency housing and owner cooperatives, as we mentioned before. Let's go on. Cost-based financing or limited profit housing, I mentioned earlier, is the new model for financing. And even though LPHAs, they're called housing cooperatives, they're large housing developers, have been around for 100 years, and there's 60 active LPHAs in Vienna right now. Their financing model really hinges on low-cost land, low-cost financing, and mixed income housing. And that together means that they can charge rents that actually pay for the cost of the development. Now, the cost of development in Vienna is about 50% of our cost, and we are still teasing out what that is, but they believe that by limiting every element of the project, whether it's limiting the financing cost or limiting the construction cost and limiting the land costs, that they can actually push their housing costs down, their construction costs down. And their rents in turn are a function of what their costs are. So there's a high incentive to have much more efficient construction costs. Let's keep going. Finally, I'll just say that they are, when their conversation around affordability in Vienna is rather quiet. They kind of solve the affordability problem. Here it's quite noisy. There you don't sense that. And what takes its place is a conversation around sustainability. They have a very proactive, interdepartmental strategy for carbon emissions reduction. They are pushing towards a carbon neutral city by 2040, and I actually believe they'll hit it. And one of the things they're doing, in addition to a lot of wood, low carbon construction, is a rehab program based on block rehab, where they completely change out the utilities for the assets that are owned by the city in particular, is where they test out the ideas for electrifying their utilities. So that's pretty much it.
And we'll stop there. So apologies, I noticed midway through that I'd had my screen capture of Riley's slide halfway or obscuring a corner of that. We'll work forward from that. Question, before I get into that, a question that came up in the panelists, and because I obviously I have an issue with talking about money and making it sound accusatory. Just wondered, is there a way to get a handle of what the soft costs are of going through the grant competition process versus what that looks like in another developer? Is all of the silly hoops that you guys are having to jump through, and silly hoops because there's limited resources and they got to allocate them some way, and that's the kind of friction they put in. Is that like a substantial portion of your development cost, or does it really just come down to land and labor costs?
I mean, there are additional costs. I mean, sometimes we hire outside consultants to help us with our financing applications. We have financial consultants to help put together the pro forma for our tax credit applications. Those are all additional costs added. But I mean, I think, again, the biggest cost factors are really, the hard costs and the construction side, the labor costs and land, you know, I mean, and development impact fees. I mean, those are significant and we don't get exempted from that. The only one we don't pay is the affordable housing one because we are developing affordable housing. So I think there's been movements in even our local jurisdictions considering not waiving, because you don't want to waive them. If you waive them, then you know, it affects prevailing, it's a prevailing wage issue, but putting them at zero or saying that they're, you know, not applicable. You know, there's legal ways to get around it. And I know Petaluma has been working on that.
I realized that one of the questions I dropped earlier was Kevin McDonald's question about have other cities followed Petaluma's lead in reducing impact fees? And
no, not all of them, and I would love them to. And I think we've been kind of advocating to other cities and saying, hey, look at what Petaluma is considering, and you know, and asking if other cities can join in and do that. I think some cities in Sonoma County, I don't know which ones, have considered it as well, but you know, impact fees can be anywhere from $1 million to 2.5 million, depending on the, you know, the size of your project, and that's significant.
Let's see, what else do we have? I think, Dave, do you have anything to pipe in with? I'm running, I think I've got all of the questions that kind of came up in the chat as we ran through. And my brain is kind of full. I am finding there's a lot to think about in that Vienna slide, but I'm not sure how we get from here to there. Dave, take it away.
Oh, I mean, with regard to Vienna, I agree completely. And the only way to get from here to there is to go back a century in a time machine and start down a different path. And I think it's still good to see what somebody else has done, just so we don't become convinced that what we're doing here is the only way it could have ever been done. But it's hard to change paths at this point. Looking back over the chat comments, I don't necessarily see any other questions I'd pull out. But perhaps what we could do, Dan, is ask people to raise their hand, offer short questions, and do that for a little while until we want to call it quits. Is that okay by the two panelists?
Cool.
Given the way Riley keeps hacking there, I'm not sure he doesn't need to just call it a night.
Yeah, I don't know. It's I got some help with some tea and honey, so hopefully that's for now.
Okay.
Go easy on our panelists, because they're already probably 10 minutes, 12 minutes over what we told them we were going to keep them around for. But Joyce, you're up. You might want to unmute.
It's not Joyce, it's Kevin. I've been trying to change that on this thing. Anyway, it's yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's really the difference between a capitalist system and a socialist system, and you certainly see the advantages of that system when it comes to certain things like housing. But I'm wondering if prefabrication and standardization of some elements wouldn't help to bring down those costs. That's one thing Europe does very well. And you know, right before COVID, there was a whole lot of stuff about housing that was sort of in a trailer. You know, it was like high end, and as a result, it was kind of expensive. But it was prefabricated units that were sort of almost like a shipping container, but they were prefabricated. It seems like during COVID, we've lost that emphasis. And it just seems to me, if we're going to do 1,900 units, doing it stick built may not be the most. That's one thing the Europeans have on us, is that they're much more advanced in building technology than we are, almost embarrassingly so.
I do know that there have been some advances in modular technology for multi-story buildings, but I don't know what the current state of that is in the US.
It's moving quite along in the architectural community, a lot of building with heavy timber, stuff like that. And it just seems that we're using a 19th century approach to building 21st century housing. And I don't know how we're going to do that on time, on budget, or at the quality of product that we would like? That's
Do our panelists have any observations on new building techniques that might?
Sure. Yeah,
that
we're
way?
always looking to consider modular prefab. I mean, I know our construction teams and our construction managers, we've done tours at Factory OS. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They are on Mare Island, and I mean, one of the difficulties about modular housing is in the suburban environment. Modular housing really works well for like an urban high rise, and where you stack the units in these certain ways. We're limited to usually three stories, where we live, and the type of housing that we build. It makes modular a little bit harder, not to say that that's impossible. So we are looking at that. But again, modular is, at least right now, it fits very well with that sort of like podium, parking bottom, and then stacking the units on top, and going for multi-stories. And but yeah, but we are looking at it. We haven't done it yet. We've still only done stick built, but it's something that we're looking into, because it can help with reducing construction costs. But as of right now, the timing and the transport and the way the financing structure works, it just hasn't quite fit yet with how we do our projects.
Could it be panelized? I mean, that's another thing, is that, you don't necessarily have to do the whole unit modular, but panelization, is something to look at.
Yeah, on 4, if I can jump in, on 4 and 4, we're doing panelization. We're producing a lot of it off-site in factories. It'll get shipped on, and then we can build an entire floor in 10 days, 15 days. Whereas if you're assembling everything on site, it's a lot longer lead time.
Cool. Kevin McDonald, you want to pipe in here?
Thank you very much. I know that HomeKey has brought a different way of funding to building home housing, general affordable housing, but homeless housing, and HomeKey 3 is on the horizon, and I'm wondering if HomeKey 2 did do a lot to reduce cost to getting things constructed. I guess it's a two-part question. What else is going on like that can break the existing gridlock on how the funding stacks work? And I noticed that Sonoma State has bought an apartment complex for essentially workforce housing. Is there funding paths for others to build to buy built product rather than have to go through the whole development procedure, which is a big stack of the overhead? Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few questions.
Kevin, I'm going to mute you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Go for
it. Several questions in there. Yeah. So I mean, I think it sounded like one of the questions you were asking was, purchasing existing developments. We'll do that with acquisition rehab. We'll either purchase existing multifamily developments or buildings and rehab them, and that way you're not under the same time constraints of building a brand new project. There's an existing stock there. Sometimes it's more substantial rehab, sometimes it's less. So that's definitely one avenue. Project HomeKey you mentioned is a good one. We don't have any projects at the moment, any HomeKey projects in Sonoma County. We've done 1 or 2 others in the greater Bay Area. But we're definitely always looking for opportunities for that here in Sonoma County.
Do you have funding for that built product? Can I bring you a project?
You can always bring me a project, Kevin, and I hope my track record would suggest that I can pull together the remaining financing. And then, so there's HomeKey, and then there's the state housing accelerator, which I believe, Jocelyn, you mentioned. 1 or 2 of your projects have taken advantage of that. One of ours that's in construction right now in Santa Rosa also did, and that was a way to open up the gridlock from tax credits, and more specifically 4% tax credits. So it was a new influx of funding, took the place of tax credits, and it definitely helped alleviate some of that. Now, the gridlock is still there, but it's not as substantial as it was before.
So I can sort of explain how HomeKey really expedited the process. That money came from COVID relief money in a sense. It started out as Project Room Key. When pandemic hit, there was a need to house, the shelterless, and keep folks isolated from each other, protect them, during COVID. And then it expanded into, the HomeKey program as we know it. And it was different. And just the way the money came. We applied, and then within 3 months, this is round one, so this is in 2020, we applied, and within 3 months, after we got, no, I would say less than 3 months, like maybe 2 months after we got awarded, we got a check in the mail, and it really came by snail mail. A check from the, HCD, and, but they imposed a lot of like deadlines and milestones. They're like, build as fast as you can within 90 days, you have to be occupied and all that. And that was just really unrealistic, because with the motel units, we had to convert them to apartment units, to permanent housing. So you had to put in kitchenettes, and then you had to make them ADA compliant. And so there's a lot more work. And then building departments don't work that fast to give you, your building permits. So in HomeKey round two, they addressed those issues. And so that there was more breathing room in terms of trying to meet those deadlines. But still, after you're awarded, within 6 weeks, we got a check for like $18 million. I've never seen a check in my life, just holding in my hand, $18 million. Here it is. The money was right there. And it came by snail mail, which was just insane too. We had our accounting department track it down, make sure it didn't get lost in I'm looking for a big check. So let's make sure, we receive it. And so we get it, we deposit it, and the money's there. You don't have to close on a loan. You don't have to go through this whole big underwriting process. The application process in itself was just enough for them to vet you and to, hand you the money. And so it's really like, it was fast. And so, we've had this one project in Napa, which is a permanent supportive housing project. We started in 2017. It's under construction now, will be completed by the end of 2021. But in the meantime, we've had all these permanent supportive housing projects get done and completed before that one did. And it's because these were HomeKey funded.
I think your point about the check coming snail mail from the state is just so poetic, and it's so accurate for the state and how they operate, which is
right.
Unfortunate.
Right.
Sorry, I muted myself, and there we are. So before I go to Dwayne, who's next on the list, the Bill Reinhardt in the chat asked about the issues, advances, incentives in converting surplus industrial or office buildings to residential. Can either of you speak to that at all?
I can't speak to that. I don't know anything about that. The only challenge there is, trying to convert that into housing, which would be just a massive overhaul of the entire, because an office building is going to be built, and the bones of that is going to be built in a certain way that's not totally conducive to housing. But I'm sure there's creative people that could figure it out eventually.
Yeah, I know in San Francisco, they've been thinking about that, and there's been some movement to try to see if, they can convert all those empty office buildings. But Riley's right. It's difficult, because an office building, the systems, it doesn't easily convert to, individual apartment units. You would have to redo the whole, all the electric, all the systems basically.
And here in Petaluma, we have a lot of single tall, but single story sprawl, which also means we aren't getting density, and we just end up, if they're in office parks, they're all drivable. Yeah. Dave, you had a hand up?
Yeah, there's actually a very good Spur video, as long as we're talking about Spur, on conversion of a skyscraper in San Francisco to multifamily housing. I will look for it. We maybe make it part of a future forum. So. And as I remember, the cost came out to be almost the same, even though you're using an existing structure. By the time you did all the other modifications, the cost per unit was probably still Riley's 800,000 per. So, thank you.
And I'm sure with something that size too, I'm sure the time probably is comparable. I mean, it might be a little bit faster because you're not building the structure of it, but all that rehab work is not a fast thing either.
Having replumbed my house, at least on the feed lines, and rewired it, the process of going through and putting in all the extra fittings for kitchens and bathrooms and stuff just sounds like a nightmare. Yeah. Dwayne, go for it.
Yes, 2 points I would make. One is for 5,500 units, it said one school, and I've always been interested in school placement, and so that children can walk to school, and that seems I wasn't sure that information was quite correct, and I'd like to see that first on our agenda is school placement and park placement for the children. The second point would be that the interest rate that was mentioned there was 1% on a 40-year loan. And I think if we had told the Federal Reserve that they should have lent housing 40 years at 1% instead of their friends speculating in the stock market, we could very well have been building houses since 2008. And my suggestion for here is that we appoint formerly homeless people to the Federal Reserve Board. Ask that of our next president.
Well, we can try, we can dream.
What a great idea.
John, your hand is up.
Okay, thank you. One of the things I'm thinking about long time is how do we build more of these homes, smaller homes for affordability, and sort of get out of the mode of, oh, it's got to be this huge building with all these amenities and all these rules and regulations. So a couple of things that have come to mind. We've had the tiny homes. We've had right here locally, we have Kmart, empty building, converting a Kmart building into some sort of multiplex that may be just roofless, just putting folks in basically cubicle, like an office cubicles, just subdividing it out and making living quarters, maybe a little noisy, but doing something like that. Then I've been to what used to be Blue Homes, I guess, down in Mare Island, where it was all modular. It's sort of almost like taking a container and rebuilding it from scratch, but almost like containerized. And they were able to put something together in a single day. One day, they could actually build out one whole room that has basically everything, or basically a small house, put on a trailer and move it and put it in the ground, and have build an entire house in 3 days. So can we use this modular building, factory made, because we look at our people's villages that we have, and this small little 10-foot by 10-foot building that folks are living in with not much to it, and there's this huge price tag on it. It says there's got to be a way we could put that into a factory building, build it out, and pop it down on a piece of open ground, and do it for less than $500,000. It seems like it would be reasonable if we had a factory method, we could do something. So if we do have an open lot, even behind our locally, we have our cots and we have some open land right there. Why can't we do that? Why can't we just be able to modular, pop it down, and do it within less than $50,000 per unit? That actually very much more livable than what we're being told over at our people's village, right? So that and then a Kmart conversion. So those are a couple of questions I might have. What's preventing us from doing things like that?
Either of you guys want to take that?
Oh boy, there's a lot. I mean, I think there's I think that there are a lot of great opportunities and ideas for, smaller development, container type developments and modular and things like that. And I think part of it is, finding land in the right space to put those things in. And I think the other challenge is going to be funding for that. If you're doing, I don't know, a handful, 5 to 10, then, that might be something that a local municipality might be able to fund on their own, or with some other dollars coming from other avenues. But, trying to go that route, either on a larger scale or through like the conventional funding pathways that, you know, Mid-Penn and Burbank and others like us go through is, you know, it feels like that would be a lot harder of a sell to the investors and other folks. It's just, you know, out of the norm of like the traditional, and I realize it's needing to break the mindset of like what is viewed as traditional. I think they would be good complements to providing additional housing stock and affordable housing. But I think complements might be like where it ends. Jocelyn, I don't know if you've got any input on those alternate ideas.
No, but I mean, I know people are thinking about it. You know, we have a potential home key site in West County that we're working with the county and West County services. And, you know, they've been exploring different ways of even possibly bringing like some of those like tiny home units and how would that work? And so, I mean, yeah, but there are challenges because a lot of the tiny homes, you know, they still need to be hooked up to infrastructure. And so it's not just a matter of bringing it in and plotting it, you know, on their site, how does it work with, building out that infrastructure too, as well. You know, I mean, you got to tie it in and, are some of those units able to be adaptable for that? And so, you know, these are all, questions, but I think, you hire your engineers to help you figure that out.
Yeah, one of my concerns with the kind of the trailer park model, which is the tiny homes thing, is that we're still going single family, relatively low density. And if land is going to be as large a cost of the project as it is, we got to go up.
Yeah, and I think another thing too with situations like that is, the developments that we do, they've got property management offices, like there's so much services and like support built into those projects, and after school programs and computer rooms and things like there's just so much built in to support those residents that if you kind of go small scale, you do these lower density options like that, it really makes it difficult to service those residents and help them in that way. If everything's condensed, everything's denser, it just, at the end of the day, it's great to provide housing, but you also got to provide the wraparound services to make sure that folks are flourishing and improving.
Okay. One of the folks that I've met along the way was Miguel of Living Earth Systems, and he builds homes and huts all over the world. I had him build a couple things for us over at Casa Grande. And looked at his plans and what he's done. He's actually gone up to Santa Rosa and other areas of the world and built small, tiny little village type things, which would be really neat for pockets of places underneath freeways or whatever, where the tents are now. So there's got to be a way of doing things like this where the tents are now without at low cost. So what do you guys think about some of those projects that he's done? He's built like little communities tucked away where there's currently like 10 cities.
I think that this is something that maybe we can turn into another Know Before You Grow session, because I think that it would be fascinating to look at what are the barriers to that. I mean, not just building costs, but building codes and all of those other things that end up happening when we build small houses, and even just the way that you build something as like a trailer to get past the building codes, so you can build as an RV and use a different set of codes on that. So John, if you want to head that up, I'd love to have that happen, but I would definitely, I'm going to see if I can put something together on this for future Know Before You Grow forums.
Yeah, we could probably get Miguel. He lives in Sebastopol now, but we could probably bring him in and have that discussion.
That'd be awesome. Cool. Well, with that, we have held our panelists for quite a while, and we've been going for over an hour and a half. Thank you very much for Riley and Jocelyn for giving us so much of your time and your expertise. Any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
No, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Riley.
No. Okay, sure. I guess my only parting statement would be, continue to be active in the community. If there's affordable housing developments that are getting proposed either near you or in the city or, throughout the county, if you're supportive of it, or even if you've got, questions or critiques, that is a good opportunity to get involved, to make sure that we, showing support locally, showing support to the city council, et cetera. So yeah, I would say that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I echo that. I mean, I just want to thank you all for, being so engaged and wanting to help find solutions, because, we need advocates in the community. When these projects come before planning commissions and city councils, we need those advocates to come out in full support. So definitely appreciate, your interest, and, thank you for having me here today.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And you had mentioned that there was somebody in your organization who was kind of involved in interfacing with state legislators. That, as we try to figure out how do we turn these words into actions, that would be an interesting conversation to have too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can kind of hook you up with some of those, connections where, if you wanted to go to a TCAC public hearing session and make comments, I mean, those are the places, where, those ideas get heard. And so yeah,
Awesome.
More information about all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Cool. Once again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Dave for all of his work organizing and for stepping in when I was fumbling. And I'll have the recording up as soon as we can get all of the video processing done. Have a good evening, everyone.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.